So we're jumping back here into Richard Morgan Casey's testimony to the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, and he's discussing the attendance note made, which contains a summary of the discussions that he was involved with the Post Office and their fear that they were on the cusp of a flood of cases and action by subpostmasters against the Post Office due to the issues with Horizon and challenging their convictions and civil judgments against them. And essentially, whilst Richard Morgan says he's not 100% sure whether he said this at the time, he certainly said that he agrees with the conclusions, that the Post Office would be damned if they do and damned if they didn't in regards to commissioning an independent expert report. He goes on to suggest and agree with the fact that if a report came and said Horizon was working properly, it would be deemed a quote-unquote whitewash, and that if it said that there was issues with Horizon, that it would open the floodgates for claims from sub-postmasters. He also interestingly discusses the structure of the Post Office and said he regarded the Post Office as a private company rather than one that was publicly owned, and therefore he would issue advice to them, for example, to say that it would be best not to commission an independent report because no good could come of it and that it wasn't in their interests, despite what was at stake. Let's jump into the inquiry.
Can we turn to the third bullet point? Whatever the findings of the expert report, it will not resolve the problem. The Post Office will be, quote, damned if they do and damned if they don't, end quote. If the findings are that there are no issues with Horizon, people will see that as a, quote, whitewash. Whereas if the findings are negative, that will open the floodgates to damages claims by sub-postmasters who were imprisoned for false accounting. And Access Legal will start to pursue all the civil cases they're currently sitting on.
And presumably at this point they're sitting on those cases in light of the group action which is taking place. Considering the position, I don't know for sure, but I'm presuming that is a possibility.
Again, do you think this paragraph records advice that you were giving?
No. And the reason for that answer is I was just not intimately involved in prosecutions or other civil claims.
You may not have been intimately involved. It may have been that people arrived at your chambers and asked you for a view on things over the course of half an hour. Why doesn't this read as if it's you giving the advice?
I don't know. I mean, it does, if you look at the bottom of that page, there is something that's attributed directly to me. I mean, my problem, Mr. Beer, is I just have no recollection of this at all. The document says what it says. You can attribute to me the high-level answers if you want to, but I just don't remember saying it.
So essentially at this stage we're saying we've only really so far in the testimony got the documentation to rely on. He's being reasonable, saying, well, that's a reasonable interpretation, but literally saying this has faded totally from my memory over the intervening years.
Third paragraph that
Yes.
we're looking at. Do you now see any significant issue with the view that is recorded there?
I agree that whatever the findings of the expert report, it won't resolve the problem. I agree that the Post Office would be damned if they did and damned if they didn't. If it was a clean bill of health, then it would be a whitewash. And if it was negative, then obviously it would invite claims.
So essentially there, whether he said it or not, he's agreeing that's the right conclusion. I mean, initially I thought he was trying to distance himself from it because it's kind of unpalatable to think like that. But I guess if you are thinking objectively about the situation, then, they've come to those conclusions basically saying you've painted yourself into a corner. Now, this wasn't inevitable. We've got to remember at this stage, Post Office have painted themselves into the corner by taking cases on shaky legal ground. So they've taken themselves to this point in 2012, some 12 years after Alan Bates first reported an issue with Horizon. They've had opportunity after opportunity to review and sort this out. they've not, and now they've painted themselves into an impossible situation where, frankly, the only moral and ethical thing to do is to hold your hands up and say, I'm not sure, we need help, let's be honest and have total transparency. But that would probably cost some very senior people their jobs, I would imagine, or attempt to cover it up, and we know what route the post office decided to take here.
I'm not sure about what the false accounting allegations are to do with, because I'm not a criminal lawyer and I don't deal with those cases.
If an independent expert said that there were problems with the integrity of Horizon, that might indeed open the way to damages claims.
Absolutely.
By subpostmasters who had been convicted of criminal offences of false accounting on the basis of Horizon data.
Mr. Beer, I don't know, because I wouldn't know the basis upon which convictions were obtained.
I mean, the refreshing thing here is this is somebody saying, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but not trying to bumble the way through pretending to be a criminal lawyer. They're actually saying, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I can't possibly comment. I'm intrigued as to why advice would be sought from him rather than somebody potentially more appropriately qualified to have a think about this. I mean, obviously, he's a very smart, intelligent person with qualifications. He's Queen's Counsel as was, King's Counsel now. But on the post office side, why wouldn't you ask? Why wouldn't you ask a criminal lawyer about the potential ramifications of the criminal case? I guess what he's trying to say here is I was giving them an overall high-level, legal, educated aspect on it, which is fine, but presumably the post office would have sought somebody specifically to do with the criminal investigation points and the concerns they had surrounding those appeals. Surely they would approach somebody with that requisite experience, you would have thought.
Again, just looking at that paragraph, do you see any significant issues or problems with the advice that's being given there?
I'm not sure that that's necessarily a fair question, because I'm not sure that I'm giving the advice. I'm also not in a position to give any advice in relation to the criminal law aspects.
What would have happened if they had started to discuss the impact of an independent report that showed that there were problems with Horizon data, and that had consequences for the pursuit of civil claims that some solicitors were sitting on in a conference that you were giving? Would you have said, stop, that's nothing to do with me, well, I'm not a criminal law expert?
I think if the question is read back, you'll find you asked me about in the context of civil claims.
Yes.
And then you've added to it, what would the consequences be in relation to criminal claims? I don't advise on criminal law, no. And I would almost certainly have said I can't give you advice in relation to the criminal prosecutions.
I'm not asking you about advice on criminal prosecutions, and this isn't anything to do with criminal prosecutions, this third bullet point. It's about civil claims arising from people who have been imprisoned, perhaps wrongfully.
Again, my answer would be the same, that I would feel decidedly uncomfortable and would almost certainly say that I'm unable to advise on civil claims arising from criminal prosecutions. It's just not an area of law in which I practice.
Would you regard it as appropriate in commercial litigation involving a private corporation to advise that a step should not be taken because it might increase the number of claims brought against the private corporation?
Yes.
Would your view be that any different considerations apply if the putative defendant is a public authority or a public corporation?
Potentially, yes.
And what are those different considerations that apply if the putative defendant is a public authority or a public corporation?
Well, one might want to think about what the public law duties are of that public corporation, but I was being asked to advise a private company.
Is that how you viewed the Post Office?
Post Office Limited.
You didn't see them as a public corporation?
I didn't see them as a public corporation, no.
I mean, and this is, I guess, where the confusion comes. So, Royal Mail, Post Office used to come under Royal Mail. Royal Mail was sold off i.e. sold to private investors and individual retail investors in 2012, at which point the post office was taken out of that, as far as I understand. And what has happened is essentially it's been set up as some kind of limited company, but the sole shareholder is the government. So to all intents and purposes, whilst the legal structure is different, it is as public as it's ever been, because the post office is 100% wholly owned by His Majesty's government, which means that essentially it's still a public corporation, or a public business, if you like. However, I guess if we look at the legal structure, you might say, well, as a limited company, it would technically be a private company, as in it's not a PLC, but that distinction may very well be correct legally, but to all intents and purposes, as far as we're concerned, the post office always has been, and was at the time, and still is, 100% owned, albeit in a different legal structure, by His Majesty's government.
Where the government holds a single share in the company on behalf of the public.
I didn't see them as a public corporation governed by administrative law.
And that can be quite integral, because the thing is, public organisations have additional duties on them compared to private companies, so that could become quite significant.
And so, in the advice that, any advice that you gave on this occasion, you would have been approaching this as a commercial chancery litigator?
Yes.
And therefore it would be appropriate to advise such a party that they should not take a step such as commissioning an expert report, even if it revealed that Horizon data was unreliable, because that might open the post office to more damages claims.
Yes, I think so. I think I would.
So there's confirmation that, in the auspices of his dealing with it as a private company, essentially saying, if you commission this expert report, no good can come from it, so don't do it. Don't allow it to happen. I mean, in any case, the defence commissioned a report. What they're saying is, don't you proactively go out as a company and commission a report into this, because there is no good ending for you from that.
I might be wrong in that, but